Hello, test, test, test.
Hello, hello. Can you hear us?
Okay, hello, Sydney.
She's coming through soon.
Yeah.
Hello.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, perfect. We can hear you. So we will switch to the presentation and later switch again.
Hello, good morning, Graz, and good evening, Sydney. This is the musical skills session, and I'm your session chair, László Stachó from Hungary, from the Liszt Academy. And please give a very warm welcome to Thijs Vroegh from the Max Planck Institute in Frankfurt.
Yes, welcome everybody, and many thanks for taking the effort to come out of your bed so early on this Friday. One small correction, it's the aesthetics.
Yes.
Yeah, slot. Yeah, exactly. So my name is Thijs Vroegh. I'm from the Max Planck Institute, and today I will talk about a study which I did as part of my dissertation called Absorption and Self-Monitoring as Experiential Predictors for the Aesthetic Appreciation of Music, a correlational study. Many, or probably most, music listeners are very familiar with the type of experience which is referred to here as absorption, which is an intense type of experience which somehow stands apart from normal everyday experience. And often these experiences go hand in hand with a high level of pleasure or satisfaction, as these pictures show. More everyday terms to describe this feeling of absorption is feeling lost in, feeling merged with or in the music, being carried away, feeling entranced, captivated, or perhaps simply fascinated. And there's even descriptions of people who describe these type of experiences as being hypnotized. Several features of absorption is, and a more formal definition is that absorption is an altered sense of reality in general and of the self in particular. Is usually considered as a cognitive phenomenon, although it is often associated with visual imagery and emotions, and is defined as being distinct from normal pragmatic forms of paying attention. Other overlapping concepts in addition to the ones I just mentioned are dissociation, trance, flow, immersion, transportation, and strong experiences with music. And before I continue, there are probably also differences between these terms, but there's certainly also a large overlap between all these terms, and they all have something in common. And in general terms, absorption is usually associated with aesthetic experiences in a positive way, but absorption is not the only way to experience, to have an aesthetic experience. Some theorists and philosophers also mentioned the concept of self-monitoring or meta-awareness as another way of getting to an aesthetic experience. Self-monitoring or meta-awareness refers to having a third-person perspective towards oneself and one's experience, where one is distancing oneself from oneself and one's experience, and in that way getting an objective and a calm perspective towards oneself and experience. It is usually considered as a prerequisite for reflection, and I included an example of what it means to be meta-aware. For example, when you during an experience ask yourself the question, why is it that I like this music so much? For example. Other conceptually overlapping concepts are metacognition, mindfulness or mindful awareness, second-order awareness, decentering, detached mindfulness or de-automation. And there are actually 20 more terms, which I didn't include on this slide, but there's a whole array of different terms to describe this type of third-person perspective. And perhaps the best illustration is to think of mindfulness or meditation as a specific type of experience where one tries to train and develop one's ability to self-monitor. In relation to aesthetic experience, results are mixed. Some research findings illustrated that self-monitoring can result to a rewarding type of experience, but there's also research which actually indicates that if you self-monitor too much, then there's actually a disrupting or negative effect on aesthetic experience. So evidently we are able to experience in music as well as thinking about it, which leads to a paradox perhaps, but on the other hand it might also be possible that they are in some way complementary. To illustrate this paradox, I want to read this quote. Suppose that I am absorbed in the enjoyment of a humorous story or a musical composition and suddenly ask myself what my enjoyment is and what mental processes go to make it up. I find myself baffled. The putting of the question has seriously altered my consciousness. I cannot enjoy and examine my enjoyment at one and the same time. Previous research failed to integrate these two constructs. So a lot of research on music and absorption or immersion usually only consider the immersion part, but fail to see its relationship with meta-awareness. So they're usually conflated or research in isolation. Why it is important to consider both is that one could pose the question whether it would be possible to combine both aesthetic benefits of both absorption and self-monitoring. For example, the concept of savoring is basically describing exactly that, so that one is absorbed, but at the same time is being able to be meta-aware of oneself and therefore being able to regulate or even maintain this positive absorption experience. And I included this quote to describe the importance. So it basically gives insight when it is best to man the controls, so when it is important to be rational and in control, and when it is better to simply enjoy the ride. One theory which fits to the opposition of absorption and meta-awareness is dual processing theories, which provide an account of how an experiential phenomenon is the result of an interplay between two distinct psychological systems. Usually there's a system 1 and a system 2, where system 1 includes fast, immediate, automatic and intuitive processing, and system 2 is the slow, logical, rational type of psychological processing. And this dual processing can be found in cognitive, but also in emotional, appraisal and consciousness literature. Okay, sorry. These two processes can be interlinked in three different ways. One is in a parallel model, which is described in this graph, where processing 1 and processing 2 are operating in parallel. The serial model assumes that type 1 processing comes before type 2 processing. And finally, the third model assumes that there is interaction taking place between two types of processing. So to test this, I conducted an online study where I asked people to choose and listen to one piece of music, and afterwards had to fill in a battery of state and trait measures. State measures are the Telecon absorption scale, which measures the trait absorption. The MAS, a mindful attention and awareness scale, which measures one's disposition to be mindful of oneself. Absorption is measured with attentional focus, altered awareness and imagery. Meta-awareness is measured as a composite of self-control, rationality, self-awareness and memory. And I also included familiarity and mental fitness. And I used non-recursive structural equation modeling to analyze the relationships between these. I included briefly this slide to describe how I measured absorption, which I measured using a bifactor model. Due to time constraints, I cannot tell too much about it, but anyone who's interested in this method can come to me later on. Aesthetic appreciation I measured using a tri-component model where aesthetic appreciation is understood as an attitude which falls apart in 3 dimensions: an hedonic short-term appraisal, a long-term appraisal component, and a behavioral or cognitive component, basically meaning one's behavioral intention. And with this 3-dimensional approach to aesthetic appreciation, one is able to capture both easy and elaborative processing, moving away from only asking whether one likes it or not. So basically I tested this model where arrows point to a causal relationship between one factor and the other. An arrow with a line with 2 arrows indicate covariation. And important in this diagram is that there is an arrow going up from state absorption to meta-awareness and back to describe the mutual relationship. And the same applies to the relationship between absorption and pleasure. And simply put, I tested this model to see how these relationships were present in the data I collected. And to illustrate, so the above part of the model describes the fast processing, so the type 1 processing, and below is the type 2 processing, where there's the mindfulness, meta-awareness, and lasting impression describe the more deeper reflective processing. This is the results which came out. Most important is that there was no relationship found between state absorption and meta-awareness. There was a reciprocity between state absorption and enjoyment. And also the relationship between the traits of absorption and mindfulness suggested an independence between these 2 constructs. And as you can see, state absorption is particularly suited to predict aesthetic appreciation outcomes. So to summarize, absorption is a very good predictor for hedonic pleasure, but important, the often seen one-directional approach where absorption predicts enjoyment does not totally capture true experience, because there's also a mutually feedback processing going on where enjoyment feeds the process of absorption. Yes, okay, I'll need through 3 sentences. Okay, absorption is also possible to predict lasting impression after accounting for the mediating effect of short-term pleasure. Surprisingly, meta-awareness was actually of little importance to the aesthetic outcome variables, which poses the question to us all, should we all just simply enjoy the ride and not think too much? And finally, absorption versus meta-awareness is aligned with dual processing theory. It's particularly helpful in further understanding aesthetic response formation, and my results favor parallel processing, which poses the question what meta-awareness is precisely is. And I made a distinction between 3 types of meta-awareness. One where there's an implicit background awareness, one where there is a descriptive introspection, so where one is only observing, and the 3rd type of meta-awareness is where one actually takes an analytical or interpretative type of reflection. And as I put in the recommendations, personally I think it's important to try to make a distinction between these 3 types of awareness. Thanks for listening.
Thank you very much, and please ask questions. You're welcome to.
Thank you very much. I'm encountering some sort of paradox if I think about your conclusion in favor of parallel processing. Perhaps you could help me on that, because you said slow and fast processing sort of in parallel, but the fast processing is fast and the slow is slow, so there is some sort of serial order to it. So perhaps you could speak on that.
Yes. Yeah, so that would indeed, what you mentioned would be a serial type of understanding how type 1 and type 2 processing is following up each other. So I was also surprised to not find any findings which support this parallel processing or even interaction between them, which might point to the fact that actually what I used to tap into meta-awareness might have tapped into a sort of background awareness, which is always there, so sort of being constantly present, even when people are totally absorbed. One indication for that is that when people are totally in flow or absorbed, they always remain able to recollect how their absorption experience was, which is a very good indication that there still is some monitoring process going on, even when people are totally absorbed. And usually people refer to it as being self-forgetful, but that's not really how it works. Otherwise people won't be able to recollect their experience. And I think that my results actually tapped more into this background awareness, this stable monitoring process, and not so much the real reflective processing going on. That would at least explain why my results were in favor of parallel process rather than serial process.
Another question?
Okay, so this answer might be an explanation for my question too, because in music and in literature there is some idea that alienation would support aesthetic violence, but if alienation doesn't work, or do you think alienation does work, but it works more unconscious?
Sorry, did you say alienation?
Yes.
What do you mean with that?
The foregrounding. You
okay.
You get that?
Yeah. Yeah. So foregrounding is. So for those who are not familiar with the concept of foregrounding, foregrounding is especially a technique used in literature, where.
But also in music.
Yeah, also in music, yeah, you're right. So it's usually a technique where the composer or film artist makes the participant aware of the fact that he or she is reading a story by means of manipulating writing techniques, or in case of music techniques. I'm not totally sure whether that is type 1 or type 2 processing. Because when people are aware of foregrounding, they are in a way still involved or absorbed by what is actually happening. But at the same time, they also need type 2 processing to process that something is different from what one usually expects. And of course, I didn't talk that much about it, but usually the type 1 and type 2 processing are highly integrated. Okay. What I did was sort of artificially extract them from one another. But I guess foregrounding would be a mixture of those two types of processing.
Thank you so much. So time's up at the moment. Thank you again.
Yeah, thank you.
And our next presenter is in the music aesthetics session is Manuel Anglada-Tort from the Technische Universität Berlin. Please give a warm welcome to him.
So, thank you very much. I'm happy to be here today sharing part of my research, what I'm doing in the Technical University Berlin. This project is called The Effects of Source Bias on the Evaluation of Music in Advertising, Professionals versus Consumers. So we know that brands spend millions of dollars procuring music to use in marketing and advertising campaigns. Extreme example of this is the Super Bowl. So we know, for example, this year, music used in commercials during this event were secured with licenses ranging in cost from $100,000 American to $750,000. And the use of music in commercials, films, games, and television, it's called synchronization or sync. And in 2017, revenues totaled by sync totaled more than 300 million. So for these reasons, in this context of the use of music in advertising, industry professionals are entrusted by their clients to make decisions about music that not only impact the advertising message, but also the associated cost of using that music. However, there is a lack of research examining the factors that can influence perceptions of music, aesthetic, and cost in this context, and that was one of the main motivations of this project, to study some of these factors involved in these processes, and we focused on the source. We thought that the source, so Steve Keller came to us and he had like this insight of thinking that the source of the music could be a potentially important factor influencing these professional decision-making processes when considering music to use in advertising and marketing. So we know that in the context of advertising, music can come from a variety of sources. Music can be recorded and released by an artist that is licensed for advertising use. It can be music made specifically for use in the advertisement by a music agency, and it can also be a piece of stock music licensed from a generic music library. And these are the three sources we're going to be looking here today. So yeah, the aim of this study is to study whether the source of the music has an impact on the evaluations of music, aesthetic, and cost in the context of advertising. And we're going to be looking at two groups of participants, a group of industry professionals and a group of consumers. We recruited a total of 163 participants in two experiments. The first one, we focused on marketing and advertising professionals with an average of 15 years in sync revenues. That was really the main challenge of this project, was to get these 50 people answering this online experiment. And then we did a second experiment where we recruited 113 consumers. They didn't have expertise in sync revenues, but were similar in age and musical training and nationality. We used a mix within and between participants design. We're going to look at group in a between participants level, and then we had two factors within participants level. That was music source, as we've seen, artist, commission, and generic library. And we're going to also be looking at three product categories: soft drink, fashion, and financial services. So we used 9 songs, 3 songs in each product category, and we fully counterbalanced this presentation of the songs with the music source within each product category. And the stimuli that we used was provided by an audio branding agency, and it's important to say that it fits within the commission music. So it was music specifically made for TV commercials, but never publicly released. I have an example here today in the soft drink category. Let's see if I can play this. So that's an example. Ooh, yes. That's an example of the artist condition. Participants would listen to the song, and then they were presented with this information on the top. In this case, it says this track is by the UK band, the Lulu, released on their second album, Summer Again, and licensed for use in a soft drink commercial. It's important to say here that in the artist condition, we used fake information. We wanted to reduce potential prestige effects, so none of these artist names exist, so we tried to be original in the names. Don't know if you like the Lulus. That's an example of commission music. Ooh. So So yeah, it says this track was commissioned by an advertising agency and created by a music company specifically for a soft drink commercial. And finally, an example of the generic library. This track was obtained from a generic music library of Audio Network, London, UK, and licensed for use in a soft drink. So participants would listen to this, and after listening to the song, we used a very short evaluation form. We were afraid of losing so many professionals if we didn't maintain this survey very short, so we just focused on 5 aspects. We looked at liking, music quality, authenticity, and music fit with the product category. And then we also had this rating scale measuring cost. In this case, it says, based on your experience, how much would you expect to pay for a 1-year-old media license to use this music in a commercial? And they had these options ranging from less than 1,000 to 1 million or more. We rephrased a little bit this in the consumer group, but we used kind of the same format in this question. So the first thing that we did here is a principal component analysis with the data from both experiments and the 5 rating scales. We saw that we had a nice one-factor solution that we're going to call this aesthetic evaluation, but it could be called quality or aesthetic evaluation factor, where we include liking, quality, authenticity, and fit. And then we had the expected cost item that didn't cluster in this single solution. So we're going to be looking at these 2 separately. So what did we find? And here I'm going to be showing now the aesthetic evaluation factor. We found in this main model that there was a main significant effect of group, a main significant effect of music source, no interaction. And because group was significant, we ran 2 separate models, one for professionals, one for consumers. And as you can see in the graph, so this source bias seems to be only affecting professionals. In this case, they evaluated the same music significantly more positively when it was presented as coming from artists compared to library and commissioned, and music source was not affected in the consumer evaluations. When looking at the expected cost, we had very similar results, a significant effect of group, source, and in this case as well, a significant interaction. And again, we see this effect of source bias in professionals but not in consumers. And professionals in this case, so they would expect to pay significantly more money when the same music was presented as coming from artists, followed by commission and library, which resulted in the lowest expected cost evaluation. So I think this study, the main finding is that when considering the source of the music, it seems that only this source bias only had an impact amongst professionals, whereas consumers are unaffected by source cues. I think this is in line with research on music evaluation and the effects of contextual information, but it's novel, this finding in showing real cost implications of contextual effects. In this case, the most important implication, I would say, is that this may have a potential financial impact for a brand. So if source bias in professionals has an impact that is meaningless to consumers, as this study suggests, brands might be paying a premium price for music use without seeing any return of that investment. So that's something to consider in this context. I think this also is in line with expert problem seen in other disciplines like clinic psychology or economics or forecasting, where not always professionals seem to be giving the best or the most congruent judgments. And to me, the most interesting bit of all of this study is how it relates to the heuristics and biases framework by Kahneman and Tversky. In this case, I think that's a very nice example of the anchoring heuristic. According to this decision rule, there is this human tendency to rely too strongly on the first piece of information presented when making judgments and decisions. In this case, they call it this is the anchor, and the music source is probably anchoring these evaluations in the professional group. I think still there is this interesting question of why this is affecting professionals, but consumers seem not to be affected by it. And maybe 2 explanations of that is the role of expectations as well as prestige effects. I'm more than happy to hear any other interpretations of these results, and maybe we can discuss this later. Thank you very much. I think I have more time, so I have a couple of other results that might be interesting. So we thought it would be interesting to look at the ratings in the 9 music excerpts in the 2 groups in the absence of music source. So we did this model only looking at the 9 music excerpts as well as group, and you can see here in the aesthetic factor how different are the evaluations in the 2 groups, and this is shown by the significant interaction and the significant effect of group, but in the evaluations of expected cost, we see no significant difference between groups. So yeah, I'm a bit puzzled about this, but we might have some explanations as well, and just something interesting to show. So yeah, thank you very much.
We are just waiting a few seconds before the Sydney signal. Is it okay to start? All right, so please ask questions. You're very welcome to. There are 2 questions first and the second one.
Hi, Manu, great talk. So I had a question about the experts. Did you gather any information of what their actual job was within the advertising and marketing companies? Because maybe that could have an effect as well.
Yeah, so this is an interesting one. So we did ask a couple of questions on what are these professionals really doing. I think one question was in which sector they are, like if it's media, marketing, advertising, which position, which role they have. And we also asked, I think there was a question of which kind of decisions they normally make in regards to music. The problem, there's a 50, so this group has 50 participants, so we thought it wouldn't be very clever to cluster this group in even smaller groups. But yeah, definitely it would be very interesting to see whether these effects differ depending on which role this person has in a company or stuff like that, yeah.
Thank you. And the second question is here in Graz still.
You asked if maybe we could provide some alternative interpretive frameworks. I guess you talked about it in terms of heuristics today. Another way of talking about it would be in terms of the Bayesian accumulation of information. So what you said was the experts are biased by this prior information. Well, another way of putting it that is maybe a bit less negative towards the experts is that everyone in this task is trying to do the job of inferring how well this track is going to perform the job. And they have 2 sources of information. One is this prior contextual information, and one is their actual appreciation of the song. And maybe these critics, they accumulate this information, both the context and the listening, to make their final judgment. Now, if you're a completely untrained listener who has no experience with the industry, you may not really know what it means to be commissioned for a commercial, or what the difference between a sound library is, or the other types of things you mentioned. Whereas this is strong information for someone in the business. So maybe they're not being biased, they understand the information better, and therefore they're better able to use it to make their final inferences.
That's a very good point. I'm going to steal it maybe for the paper. Yeah, it's a very good point. So the question, like in similar studies as well, is whether this is actually a bias or not. And at the beginning, our hypothesis really was to expect source bias in both groups, which it would be really way less interesting. And then someone would say, well, why that's not a bias, right? Like that they are doing their job properly. And you're right in your explanation, and that may be true, but still, they are working in these places, and they're having different kind of evaluation, and they are affected in a way that doesn't correspond to the way that consumers would evaluate the music. So they might be thinking, oh, if I use music from a library, consumers might not like. That's cheaper music because they might not appreciate that or whatever. And because there is no this incongruency between the groups, I think it's what maybe allows me to consider this as a bias, or at least as something to talk about. But yeah, that's a very interesting one. I think also there's like this effect of sometimes more is less, where this extra knowledge, and this is what we are seeing here, so being able to interpret what these labels mean, create this situation, and still, like, I'm not sure to what extent this is a bias or not, but at least what we can see is that it doesn't correspond to the general audience.
Thank you for your answer.
Thank you very much. And hello, Sydney people. Thanks very much for being with us. So please, if you have questions, please signal to us. Can you hear us? Maybe?
Yes, we can hear you.
Very good. So if you have questions.
I know, sorry, we haven't got any questions for this one, sorry.
No problem. So what about Graz here again? There is time for one more question, at least. So if not, thank you so much for your presentation.
So, yeah.
And please feel, please have a very warm welcome to Iris Mencke from Frankfurt again, from the Max Planck Institute for Empirical Statistics, for this last talk.
Thank you very much. Hello, everybody. I'm Iris Mencke. I'm today presenting an interview study, which is, as my PhD, a collaborative project between the Max Planck Institute for Empirical Aesthetics and the Music in the Brain Center in Aarhus in Denmark. And my interview study is about the aesthetic experience and the musical pleasure in contemporary classical music. So just a bit about a bit of background. So as we all know, music evokes very strong experiences in listeners. However, so far the diversity of music has not really been taken into account, so regarding tonality, regarding rhythm, timbre, and form. These features diverge dramatically across and within any given culture, and also within and across any given epoch. This diverse music leads also to a very diversified listening experience. However, current research and current models of aesthetic experience have only focused, or have mainly focused, on Western tonal music. And this music is mostly consonant, is very regular, and is providing a tonal hierarchical structure. This might have led to a one-sided view regarding the qualities that underlie an aesthetic experience of music, and therefore there is the necessity, from my standpoint, of including a much broader range of musical genres onto the research agendas, like, for example, contemporary classical music, which is kind of can be seen as the opposite of Western tonal music, because it mostly lacks a tonal hierarchical structure. It is very unregular regarding meter and is often dissonant, and it is very hard to predict. So let's try it and listen to an example by Sciarrino, a piano sonata. Okay. Okay, that's, maybe enough for now. So on this music, not like really only very sparsely research has been done with regard to atonal music. However, the behavioral studies that have been conducted show that it is difficult to process. It is also difficult to remember and difficult to recognize. And due to the low number of groupings, it might impede predictive mechanisms as well. In the neuroscientific domain, it's even worse, kind of. So atonal music has been used as a more unpleasant stimulus, and not as a style in its own right. It has used as unpleasant dissonant music, as a less preferred musical genre, and as a controlled stimulus for non-musical auditory inputs. I think this is not kind of fair, so I'll see the necessity to see it as a musical style in its own right. Also because I think modern atonal music plays still a very important and very specific role in Western society, because it's a highly innovative genre and represents the musical avant-garde still. And due to its specific characteristics, it might equally lead to a very specific aesthetic experience. And therefore, the aim of the whole project, and also the PhD project, is basically to complement the scope of musical genres by contemporary classical music in order to get a full picture of the aesthetic experience of music. So the underlying research, the basic research question I'm asking is, why do actually individuals seek for such an experience with music that is barely predictable, that is full of dissonance, and that does not kind of seem to follow any clear rules? In this interview study, I'm asking the research question, so what are the particularities of the listening experience with this sort of music? And of course, most importantly, what are the enjoyable aspects of listening to CCM? What is the musical pleasure like? For this, I chose an exploratory, qualitative approach, also because I'm interested in the phenomenology of this experience. with expert interviews in 2 groups in order to compare the experience of contemporary classical music with classical music to have a comparison. So some basics about the study, the experts. So in total, I conducted 16 exploratory semi-structured expert interviews with a group of classical music experts and a group of contemporary classical music experts. And the criteria were that they have had long-lasting experience in the style and that their main occupation was also in the corresponding domain. Some more infos, but I'm going to skip that. So for some comments on the procedure was just that they had to prepare a selection of 3 favorite pieces in order to be prepared for the interview, for the questions. Also, they then had examples which they can refer to during the interview. And for these genres were not further specified. So the basis for all interviews was an interview guide. And of course, both groups, all people got the same questions, only with regard to the corresponding genre. The interview guide was retrieved or inspired by the model of Hargreaves, by the reciprocal feedback model of musical response. And because we were, of course, interested in the listener and what's going on in the listener during music listening experience, we were focusing on the list on the aspects that are mentioned in the under response. That means our question addressed the physiological level, so the arousal level, affective level, and the cognitive level. So here you can see the interview guide, but only a part of it, because what I'm going to show you today, the results I'm going to show you today, are kind of an excerpt of the analysis. So this part of the analysis that I've been done, basically. So I'm going to show you results on what people have, what kind of expectations people have towards a listening experience, what kind of emotions they experience, and how they experience beauty and pleasure and what they enjoy in this genre. Briefly about the analysis and the software I was using. I used QCAMAP, which is a web application open access program developed by Philipp Meiring and colleagues in 2014. And it kind of provides tools to conduct a quite guided analysis of QDA, like an inductive and a deductive analysis approaches. And it enables a very straightforward analysis process. So let's go straight to the results. With regard to expectation, so most important for people, fans of contemporary classical music, is the cognitive stimulation. So, for example, I would like to find aspects that I did not understand. Second important is the unknown, that they want to experience something new, something novel. That is important. In contrast, in classical music, the most important aspect is to experience something like regarding tranquility or contemplation. So an example is, I would like to enter a kind of contemplative state. And on second important for the classical musicians or the classical people was also to experience something novel, something unknown, but this is more with regard to interpretation. So this is something I have to make clear a bit. With regard to emotions, the categories were kind of descriptive. So I actually collected all the emotions that were being mentioned during the interview and just sorted them and put them in categories. So in contemporary classical music, one can see that the high arousal emotions, I will go into detail that in the summary, are very important, are being mentioned a lot. And in the classical music, this was very interesting. The emotions being experienced are all, like many of them are linked to sadness. Right, and also interesting, and that's what I'm going to compare in a minute, that also high arousal emotions are quite important for them. So here the most important category or topic actually is the experience of beauty. So in the contemporary classical people, the beauty experience was very often linked to the sound experience. So an example, simply perceiving an incredible sonic situation that you cannot break down analytically. Second important was pattern recognition, so to find a pattern. Example here is if a piece of music somehow provides I just call it listening guide. Then just one example from the anti-aesthetic, so many people reported that actually beauty is not really an appropriate category for contemporary classical music, which is reflected in beautiful. I don't know whether this is a good question now. The question is the beautiful so important? In classical music, as I said before, the interpretation is a crucial and important aspect of enjoying classical music. However, very striking was that many people talked about the structure, the harmonic relationships, and the clear principles that classical music has, basically. And here are some examples that you can read, but I might quickly skip them. So, to sum up, the first results I made, my analysis from this study, from these interview data, is in regard to expectation. It's much more diverse in contemporary classical music, and there's a striking contrast between cognitive stimulation in CCM and contemplation as an expectation, motivation towards a listening experience. And regarding emotions, so here we have the high arousal emotions in both styles. And what you can see is that in CCM, we have emotions like excitement, stimulation, thrilling, even shock, fright, and twitching were being mentioned. And in classical music, we have the emotions of encouragement and inspiration, no, not inspiration, awakening, euphoric, and cheerfulness. So they're slightly more positive, but similarly arousing, but that also needs a bit more of interpretation. And important maybe to say is also that classical music has also a couple of low arousal emotions which did not play a role in the CCM group, so like relaxing, meditative, spiritual level. With regard to beauty and pleasure, so first the experience of sound in CCM and versus the interpretation in CM is a striking difference. And in both groups, that is like the really interesting part of that so far is that clear structural aspects were being mentioned. But the thing is that classical music has recognizable principles, has harmonic structures, and that was being ascribed as very, very enjoyable. Whereas in contemporary classical music, the finding of coherence and the finding of patterns was being mentioned as enjoyable. So while the one music has it, the other one doesn't have it. But yeah, as the listeners, we seek for such patterns. Okay. Right, this is what I have said. Conclusions are, there's a lot of work to do still, and I want to do all these things here. And the basic aim is, of course, to create different listening profiles of different musical styles. And in particular regarding contemporary classical music, I want to identify the unique qualities of an aesthetic experience with contemporary classical music. Thanks for your attention.
Not yet. Just a second for Sydney. A few seconds more. Okay, questions please. Grazie. Oh, maybe you first and you second. Absolutely, yes. This is what I thought.
Hi, Iris. Thank you for the talk. There's something missing, or I missed, from your presentation, which is the corpus. When you included a Cherinus piece, for example, that struck me as early music. I mean, in new music circle, for that, so it's early music. It's like talking about the aesthetic experience of pop and using the 80s as corpus.
Yeah.
So when you conducted the interviews, what was the repertoire that came up, roughly?
In the contemporary classical domain, I actually did not really look it up, but there was the Ligeti atmosphere was, for example, mentioned twice, I think. But I know what you mean. There's a huge variety of contemporary classical music, and the example I selected was, of course, a very strong example of this kind of music. The thing is that the diversity of the pieces that they chose as examples was the same. So some refer to something very complex and very loud, and some to something very minimal. And actually that reflects that it's super individual whether you like a loud, complex music or a minimalistic one.
But this is the kind of data that you collected in the end, the repertoire, or not?
I did collect it. It's actually in the interviews, but I just did not look at it. It was an idea also to present a list of pieces, but just due to time constraints, I skipped that part. But I'll definitely look into that.
Okay, cool.
Thank you. The second question is nearby.
Thank you. You mentioned that if I understood correctly, that you specifically did not interview musicians.
Mm-hmm.
Could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, so we excluded, I wanted to exclude musicians and composers because they might have a different approach to listening to pieces, basically. So the musicians might find relevant aspects due to how good you can play the piece or how difficult it is or whatever. And composers might find something like from a perspective of composing very interesting. But I wanted to only focus on perception, and therefore I chose people who have to organize, who have to deal with what is being heard and what other people will hear when they organize this program or this festival or so. Does that make sense?
Why don't we leave some more time for questions? Okay, the first is...
Hi, thank you for the talk. Just a curiosity, if you have an idea of, if you ask about the preference the listener who prefers more classical music, pop music, jazz, if there is a connection on the response of you don't have idea about the preference of your participant in terms of everyday listening?
So I did not ask for this, no.
You don't. So you excluded musician and composer, but you still don't know. I mean, if there is a different response based on the preference of the participant.
Well, what do you mean with the response? Because this is kind of qualitative, like data.
Yeah,
do you mean that response?
No.
I guess it might be different, of course, but this was really not really the topic. No.
Just the interview.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. There's one question from Sydney, if I may.
Or here.
Hello. I was just wondering if you had kind of looked at the differences between contemporary classical music and classical music as both being classical music or Western art music, and comparing that potentially with non-art music, because although you're correctly saying that they're stylistically at odds, they're part of the same cultural paradigm of classical Western art, classical music. So I was just wondering if you'd explored that at all.
I think I did not get this really, because what's the difference like what is non-art, music that is no art?
Well, not Western art music, as in commercial music or world folk music, non-classical tradition.
Okay, and what was the question with this again?
I'm just wondering if you would want to unpack that difference, the fact that contemporary classical music is actually part of the same cultural paradigm, even though it's stylistically different from classical music. Because the cultural paradigm influences people's approach to it and their perception of its beauty and interest. They might have a completely different response to non-Western art music.
Yeah, that's true. So I'm totally aware that this is centered to Western culture, and but I did not take this into account because I had a very specified comparison I wanted to make. This would be part of a larger
future
project.
Research.
Yeah,
Maybe, yes.
exactly. Yeah,
absolutely. Right. If you don't mind, so there is one more question here. A quick question, maybe. So a very quick one. So we will have a 1 hour break after this. So, for posters, yes, for posters.
Where's the question?
Okay, I raised my hand shortly. I wonder because I really like this talk, and also that you ask just people how they really feel about this kind of music, even though they are experts. If you want to go to a general population, you also have people who don't know anything about either CCM or CM. But my question is, it seems to me why they listen to this music might relate to some personality difference. Do you think that these people are actually different people, like, you know, extrovertic, open-minded, something people who are into CCM, and more general distribution for the CM? Or were they?
So this is actually what we want to test. So with regard to openness to experience, I mean, people who are interested in art generally score higher in this in this dimension, and I would be interested whether CCM people do score even higher in this part. So that is this is definitely a question, but there is the assumption. Yes. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Poster session follow.